So I'm going to go ahead and start out my Module 7 assessment by explaining my experience with reading assessments. And I gained a lot of my experience by completing Clubhouse last semester, and in that experience I got to work with 9 4th through 6th graders and work with them once a week to develop their reading skills over the course of a 10-week period. And with that experience, I learned a great deal about how to utilize reading assessments to then drive my instruction to make sure that every lesson that I created was individualized for the student, to make sure that their needs were met, their strengths were improved on, and their weaknesses were accounted for, and then also scaffolded up so that they could improve on those as well. This was the first time I really utilized assessment in that manner, and it was a huge eye-opener for me to how powerful assessment can be, and how it doesn't have to be something that students are forced to complete at the end of a lesson, but it can be something that starts your lesson planning. So you complete the assessments before you even begin to lesson plan, so you understand where the students are and what they need and where they need to grow, and then you can create your lessons to meet those needs, and then your lessons are much more successful and the students are more successful because it's created specifically for them. So then after reading the articles, explaining the importance of reading assessment is easy for me because it's very passionate based for me, because early reading assessment is crucial to student success. Research shows that children who get off to a rough start with reading rarely ever catch up, and that was prevalent in the article Catch Them Before They Fall, Identification Assessment to Prevent Reading Failure in Young Children, which was written by Joseph Torgerson and found at readingrockets.com or .org. And in that article, Torgerson stated that the poor first grader almost invariably continues to be a poor reader, which is devastating because the consequences of a rough start to reading only intensify with passing of time, unless there's an intensive intervention that's implemented. So the longer that students have to wait before intervention is given to them, the farther they fall behind, and the harder the intervention will be in order to be successful. So one of the quotes that really stood out to me in Torgerson's article is, "It is a tragedy of the first order that while we know clearly the cost of waiting too long, few school districts have in place a mechanism to identify and help children before failure takes hold," which is devastating because all too often identification of reading difficulties don't occur until 3rd grade, and at that point it's almost impossible to get students back up to grade level in their reading. And at that point they're now no longer learning to read, they're now reading to learn, and so now they're at a deficit for being able to learn because they're not able to read at a level that allows them to be successful. And then that concept also leads to a more remedial rather than preventative model of intervention. So rather than trying to prevent reading failure from ever occurring, when you wait that long to identify any kind of reading difficulties, you're only kind of fixing it, putting band-aids on it, and trying to improve it as best as possible rather than preventing the failure from ever occurring in the first place. By being able to identify these problems as early as possible is the best solution for the problem of reading failure. Reading failure doesn't have to exist. It's something that can be prevented, and only about 5 to 7% of students with reading disorders don't respond to appropriate instruction, like explicit, highly structured instruction. So there's a very small percentage of students that aren't going to benefit from this. So based on all the knowledge that I gained from the article written by Torgerson, it really shows that the earlier students can be identified with any kind of reading difficulty, the better off they will be in the long term. So, moving on to the next question. Describing tests that evaluate the 5 essential elements of reading. So the 5 essential elements of reading are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. So when trying to answer this question, it really brought to home the quote that was in Should We Test Reading or Dibbles?, which was by Shannon on literacy. And the quote that really stuck out to me in that article was, "The alphabet soup of inventories, diagnostic tests, screeners, monitors, and dipsticks that provide early reading instruction like Dibbles, Erta, CTOP, etc." So in that quote, the author is really portraying how all these letters that are construed for all these different tests that are used to assess reading can be very overwhelming, and it's just so many letters to try to keep organized and understand and know what letters represent what tests and what tests are testing what areas, and it can be very, very confusing. Something that becomes very overwhelming for me when I try to look at all these different tests. So for phonemic awareness, that's the ability to identify and manipulate sounds and words. And so based on the Catch Them Before They Fall article, they separated that skill into 3 broad categories. So in order to assess that skill, you can evaluate sound comparison, phonemic segmentation, and phoneme blending. So those are the 3 broad categories. And then you can use the phonological awareness test, which assesses 5 different categories of phonemic awareness, but still encompasses those 3 main areas. The Yapsinger test of phoneme segmentation is another test that can be used, as well as DIBELS and early reading diagnostic assessment. So there's a lot of different tests that all have their own variations of having students identify specific sounds and words and manipulating the positions of sounds, all on the basic component of being able to hear and then manipulate sounds, but they all have their own ways and their own lengths of time associated with each test, and they all have their own benefits and pros and cons. Then with phonics, you have the Texas Primary Reading Inventory, Iowa Test of Basic Skills, Test of Word Reading Efficiency. There's a lot of different tests that all test phonics. Fluency is another really common area that is tested with reading. Fluency is the automatic ability to read words in connected text. And the oral reading fluency is assessed by having a student read a passage for a minute and then calculating the amount of reads they were, and then deducting anything that they read incorrectly or didn't stay in that passage, and then using that rate to determine how accurately and how quickly they read. And so that method is used in DIBELS and the Test of Word Reading Efficiency and Texas Primary Reading Inventory. So all 3 of those tests also use oral reading fluency to evaluate a student's ability with reading. And then comprehension is the process of understanding the meaning of text. Oh, and for the last 3, so phonics, fluency, and comprehension, all of this information is coming from the Early Reading Assessment, a guiding tool for instruction, which is written by Access Center and found on Reading Rockets. So comprehension can be assessed by having a student read a passage and then retell what they've read to show that they understood the information and can re-articulate in their own words. And then they could also be asked to answer comprehension questions, and those questions can be leveled, either very concrete or more inferential and very abstract for those questions. The Early Reading Diagnostic Assessment, Iowa Test of Basic Skills, and the Texas Primary Reading Inventory all assess comprehension as well. So then with vocabulary. So I use the Reading Assessment Database to find some tests that evaluate vocabulary, and the 2 that stood out to me the most was the Bracken Basics Concept Scale and Bracken School Readiness Assessment, and those are both created by Bruce Bracken, and those tests evaluate a student's ability with the vocabulary they would need to be successful in school at a kindergarten level. So being able to identify shapes and colors and size increments, like tall, short, big, small, all those things that are essential to being able to understand any of the information that would be conveyed and anything that they would be asked to complete at that level. So it would be essential to know that students can understand that vocabulary before you're presenting them with any kind of any reading assignments that would utilize that vocabulary. So final question. Discuss limitations of using only one form of assessment. So the main reason for assessment is to drive instruction. So if you're only using one form of assessment, you're only testing one area, then you can only instruct in that one area. You're not going to be able to accurately understand the student's ability or strengths or weaknesses in any other area because you haven't assessed for it, so you can't teach on that. So you have to fully understand your students before you can begin teaching them effectively. And as stated in the early reading assessment article, the first step in implementing good reading instruction is to determine student baseline performance. So you have to know where students are before you can improve them. So you have to do an assessment first and foremost, understand where they are, their strengths, their weaknesses, and then you can progress from there. So in reading all these different articles, I found some interesting concepts. So comparing the Catch Them Before They Fall article with early reading assessment, the Catch Them Before They Fall emphasized predicting reading difficulties. So they advocated for using one test because the use of multiple tests, it would increase the accuracy of the prediction, but not at a level that made the time and effort and resources put into those other tests worth it. So they recommended only using one test to determine if there was some difficulties prevalent, and if there was, then do additional tests to then determine where the difficulties were. In early reading assessment and the emphasis for assessment for instruction, they advocate for doing several tests to really understand the student in the most complete manner. So you can understand all of their abilities in every aspect of reading to make sure that they have all the building blocks to then develop down the road, and make sure that nothing's missed out. So I think that is everything. Thanks.